Okay, so we are on page 16 in your packet. And I want to start today with some refresher on graphing on the calculator. So I'm going to pull my calculator over so you guys can see it on the screen. Right now you're looking at page 16, that's in your packet, but I'm going to pull the calculator over so that we can take a look at our calculator as well. There is a graph scratch pad. So for the work we're going to do today, you can use the graph scratch pad. I'm going to add a graph document, a graph page in a document. I want you to be aware that there are some features in Scratchpad that are just shut off. If you use the Scratchpad, they're just not available. So when we do some more sort of intense analysis with graphs, you're going to want to add a graph page to a document and not use Scratchpad. So for today, Scratchpad should be fine, but I'm going to be in the habit of just adding a graph page because they can do a little bit more than Scratchpad can, okay? So the first function that we have, equation A, is 2 to the x power. We typed in 2 to an exponent, or I think it was 3 to an exponent yesterday. So I'm going to type in 2. And then since my exponent is not a squared, I'm going to use that caret key from last time. And then my exponent is x. So 2 to the x. And then I can hit enter, and it'll graph my function here. So we're kind of tapered on the left side of the graph, and then we shoot up here. So I want to know which graph on page 16 seems to match this function. So I went ahead and labeled my graphs so we could talk about them a little easier. I labeled them, just numbered them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Which of those graphs seems to most closely resemble equation A? Yeah, 3, this third one here. Okay. So if you guys want to go ahead and write equation A under here, that's equation A. And then I'm going to bring my calculator back up, and we're going to graph another equation. Now, you can just graph the next equation and leave this one here. If I hit the tab key, it'll bring up a function line where I can graph a new equation. Since we've got 2, 4, 6, 8 equations to graph, I'm not going to put them all on the same coordinate plane because that will get very crammed very quickly. So if I want to get rid of this one, I can hit the delete key 3 times. And it'll ask me if I want to delete everything on that graph. I'm going to say yes to get that old one to go away. And then I'm going to hit the tab key to bring up that entry line again. I'm going to graph equation B next. So that's 2 times x. Remember, your x key is down here. Your variable key is down here. 2 times x squared. Since it's x squared, I can use the square key. Bless you. Minus 3. I'm going to hit enter to graph that. This time I've got this sort of U shape. Which of my graphs seems to match that equation? Graph 6, oops, yep, right here, has that U shape. So under 6, I'm going to put equation B. And then I'm going to go ahead and delete this equation and hit the tab key to bring up our entry line again. Let's skip to equation D. That's a sine function. I know you guys worked with those trig functions last year in geometry, so you've seen sine before. Just in case you don't remember where it lives, there is, let me grab one of my calculators. There is a button that has all those trig functions. It's right under the blue control button right here. It says trig on it. So I'm going to hit that button and it brings up that menu for me. We want sine, so I'm going to select sine. And then we want sine of x. So I'm going to type x inside those parentheses and hit enter. And there's my sine of x graph. Which of my graphs matches sine of x? Mm-hmm. 8. Yep, 8 has that sort of oscillating up and down. Kind of similar to what we saw the other day with our graph story, where he was doing the bench press up and down, up and down. That's graph 8. So that would be a sine graph. Then I want to take a look at one more of these graphs together. I'm going to hit the tab key, and I want to graph equation G. So I'm skipping down to G. Equation G is negative x. I wanted to graph this one together because I want to point out that we have a negative sign key here. If you use the subtraction sign instead of the negative sign when you are talking about the very first piece of a function, the very beginning of it, if I use the negative sign, sometimes our calculators will give us errors depending on what update you're on or what software you're running. So anytime that you are starting with a negative, so in C, we start with a negative. In G, we start with a negative. If we're starting with a negative, use the negative sign. So we have negative x here, the negative x, and there's our graph. Which of our graphs matches negative x? 4, yep. I have a few lines with negative slope, but negative x should go through the origin, and 4 does that. Graph 4 does that. I would like you guys now to take a minute and graph the rest of those functions and match them. So I'm going to put the ones we already found up on the notes paper on the screen. I would like you guys to finish page 16, match your functions with your graphs, and then we'll check our work in just a minute. Which of these graphs is the graph of equation C? 5, graph of equation C. This is a linear equation in y equals mx plus b form. I know my y-intercept should be 3. I have a slope of -0.5. That matches what we see here with graph 5. We did D. How about E? F of x equals 5. Which of these graphs is the graph of 5? Yeah, that's everywhere that y is 5. So graph 2 matches equation E. F. 7. The graph of f of x equals x is 7. Also a linear equation. And then we did G. So our last graph would be H, square root of x. This one has to be 1 by process of elimination, right? That's the only one we have left. Questions for me on the graph or graphing on your calculator? Okay. So the next thing we're going to do, turn to page 17 for me. as some review to sort of combine graphing functions and our graph stories, I've got some different scenarios for you. And essentially what we're doing is kind of like a card sort, except for without having to cut out a bunch of cards. So on page 17, you have sort of a record sheet where you're going to put all your answers. And you're going to be given some sort of situation, a set of graphs, and a set of equations. And so your job is to match the situation with its corresponding graph and the equation that could describe that graph. I strongly suggest you start by figuring out which graphs match which equations. That's what we just did. So that's where I suggest you start. Okay, pair up your graphs and equations. If you turn the page again, you've got your situations here. So I would skip these for now. We'll come back to those. On page 25 is the start of your graph. Notice you have two blank coordinate planes, okay? So you'll have two equations that won't have a graph. So you'll fill those in here. So your graphs start on page 25 and continue on page 27. All of your equations are on page 29. So your goal, again, is going to be to match an equation or a function with a graph with a scenario. We just did matching an equation with a graph. So I suggest for today you start there, and then we can move into the graph story piece of it. Okay, does this scenario, like what we looked at yesterday and the day before, does this scenario match this picture? Okay, so we'll work on this today and tomorrow. Start by matching your equations on page 29 with your graphs on pages 25 and 27. Does that make sense? Okay, you can use your calculator. Okay, so just like we did together for page 16, we graphed a function on our calculator and then figured out which graph best match that. You're doing the same thing here to start. So get the graphs and the equations matched together, then start looking at which of those stories could match a particular graph. Okay? Okay, 1 second.